I'm a great admirer of my next guest's work. David Swanson is the executive director of World Beyond War. He is also a campaign coordinator for Roots Action. He's a prolific writer, both columnist and author. He has a new book coming out with friend of the program, Medea Benjamin, called, I hope I get this right, NATO, What You Need to Know. And he's written a couple of columns recently about NATO as well that I really wanted to talk to him about, mainly in the context, as we'll get into, of some of the recent expenditures that Congress has passed, military in nature. But first of all, David, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Well, I've looked forward to this for a while, and NATO is an important subject because I don't think people understand what it is. I don't even think a lot of its supporters understand exactly what it is. Those who have been around a while, who are older, may think of it as that organization of countries that was formed to resist the Soviet Union. Younger people may think, well, it's just some sort of organization created by treaty that makes sure countries don't get picked on or something. But let's start with a pretty broad question. What the hell is NATO?
Well, it is an alliance of national governments. Way back when the Soviet Union ceased to exist, I'm not sure everyone has quite grasped that fact even to this day. NATO had 16 member countries, and it now has twice that. It now has 32 member countries and dozens of partner countries. The distinction being required by the fact that to be a NATO member, according to the treaty that created NATO, you have to be in Northern Europe or be the United States or Canada. And they have added countries from Colombia to Mongolia to Australia and all in between as partners. So it's a global alliance of national governments. It's arguably illegal under the UN Charter. We can talk about that, but it's not itself a legal entity. People in the United States think, oh, this war isn't being waged by one outlaw country based in Washington, D.C. It's being done by the international community under the auspices of NATO. That sort of conflating NATO with the United Nations. It's actually a gang of countries, and if it's committing a crime, it's just more countries committing a crime together. If it's doing something good and acceptable, then it's more of them doing that. But it's not a legal body. It's not an international global organization. It does make up about 3/4 of the world's military spending, which isn't surprising considering that the US alone makes up about half of the world's military spending. So it's dominated by the US. It's run by the US. It's not a democratic institution. It doesn't have recorded votes or open meetings on anything. Everything is decided by so-called consensus behind closed doors. And the threats and the bribes to get what the US wants out of NATO are just open, routine, no shame at all. And so it was created for the Cold War, or as part of what created the Cold War. After it was created, the Soviet Union created something parallel called the Warsaw Pact, which it then abolished when it abolished itself. And NATO, instead of shutting down, expanded with top US diplomats and officials declaring it to, George Kennan said it would be the worst decision in history to expand NATO. Numerous people, of course, predicting that it would lead precisely to a war in Ukraine. And yet the expansion rolled on from, Clinton and Bush and Obama and Trump and right to this day. And it's an institution that people, yes, thought of as defensive, but not only has it doubled since the days people recall its existence, it's fought a number of wars since then. Most of them outside of Europe, none of them defensive. It's fought wars in Yugoslavia, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in great degree in Iraq, and of course contributed mightily to the creation of the current crisis in Ukraine. So it's it's something that we really need to take seriously if we're going to take the problem of war seriously, because NATO is the big player.
And you made a couple points that I really want to dig a little deeper into. First of all, you used what I realized as you were speaking was this word has been used almost like a magic invocation or auspices. It sounds so official, right? It sounds legit. If I say, well, I want to go and bomb this country whose people I don't like, that doesn't sound good. That sounds like what it is, which is a war crime or illegal invasion, whatever the particulars dictate. If I say I'm doing this under the auspices, look, Lucky Luciano could say that he's, conducting, calling for a murder hit under the auspices of his relationship with Capone or whomever, but you know, it's not official. And I think that's one point that you were making, that when war crimes occur, when one country commits war crimes, this is not an international body that by sanctioning or approving that can determine whether it's legal or not, right?
Quite the opposite, indeed. Yes. The problem is that it's an excuse. You hear in the United States Congress all the time, we aren't responsible for investigating these atrocities. These happened in a NATO war, right? So it's cover. It's an excuse not to be responsible for things. The one and only time that the most dangerous provision in the NATO Charter has been used, the one that says, if this one country is at war, all the other NATO members have to join in. This disaster that people rightly shunned after the First World War. What madness to commit to somebody else's wars. Well, the only time it's been used was after the terrorist crimes of September 11th, 2001. Even though every single NATO member has been victimized by foreign terrorism, when the one member that counts
Mm.
wants it to be a war rather than a crime, wants it to be an excuse to invade a country or multiple countries rather than prosecute somebody, well, then that Article 5 is invoked. And when NATO takes over the war in Afghanistan, oh, it's a NATO war now. Then when the Iraq war becomes so unpopular that everybody has to oppose it, well, they can't oppose two wars at once. They'd be some kind of freak. So they have to find a good war. So you oppose the war in Afghanistan and support the smart war in Iraq and support the smart war in Afghanistan with Barack Obama. Part of what facilitates that pretense that the war in Afghanistan was somehow legal, somehow authorized by the UN, as people fantasize to this day, although it wasn't, is because it was authorized by NATO, which has no legal power to authorize anything. In fact, under the UN Charter, war itself is illegal everywhere and always, with a couple narrow exceptions. One is if the UN authorizes a war, which it doesn't do. And the other is if you claim that the war is defensive.
Right.
Going halfway around the globe to attack one of the poorest countries on earth because somebody committed a crime in New York City or Washington, D.C., isn't a defensive war. And so, involving NATO doesn't make it any more legal. And pretending that it's somehow in line with the UN Charter for once there's a war going, everybody pile in. That's absolutely contrary to the UN Charter. On the theory that the UN was going to authorize a country to defend itself, there's nothing in the UN Charter that says, oh, and all its friends can join in. Absolutely not.
And this gang of X number, whatever it is now, 32 approach, didn't prevent, for example, the war in Afghanistan from being an utter disaster, despite the three-quarters of the military spending in the world being represented by this NATO alliance. America was bogged down for 20 years and basically left in defeat with the same Taliban in power that was in power when they invaded. So it doesn't even in terms of doing things that are illegal, also doesn't seem to have a lot of practical value in some of these situations, even if you want to do the illegal thing. So, because it didn't work out, Iraq didn't
Yeah.
work out. So, I want to talk about another dimension of the history of NATO, David, which is because I think it's important, which is uh, the transition away from the Soviet Union and the Soviet sphere. First of all, I've never been clear on one factual matter, but I had the impression that either Gorbachev or one of his successors floated the idea, if not of becoming a member of NATO, becoming a member of a successor organization or in some way developing a mutual defense pact. Is that true?
Oh, absolutely. Not just Russia, but the Soviet Union back at the start of all this wanted to join NATO, and the United States never considered the idea to be acceptable in any way because number one, it didn't think Russia or the Soviet Union, as it came into being, would bow down before the United States. It would want to be an equal partner, with a say so in the thing. And that's not what NATO is. NATO is the United States and its sidekicks and its lapdogs. And number two, because the Russian threat has long been, and certainly in recent years, overwhelmingly has been the raison d'etre, the justification for
Right.
NATO. If there were no Russian threat, what would be the point of NATO? And so you can't let Russia join and be part of it. Now, it did make Russia a partner for peace of all crazy things, but it suspended that, as well as Belarus's partnership in the past few years because of the crisis in Ukraine. But Russia was never made a partner in the sense of being in on decision making, and it never would be. But yes, throughout the years, it's been repeated that Russia has asked, can we be in NATO? Can we be in Europe? We're Europeans, we're not Asians. And they've been told to get out of here, go to hell. And of course, when Germany reunited, the promise was made by numerous US officials, we will not expand NATO if you go along with this reunification of Germany. And that was a lie. And they immediately began working on expanding NATO, just
Yeah,
as
and
they
I'm
were.
going to stop you there because I do want to get into that. But even before we go there, uh, here's the pivot that I think people miss or don't think about, right? Which is this: it wasn't created because we don't like Russians speaking people and their soup tastes terrible. It was created. The reasoning used was that the Soviet Union represents an ideology that is antithetical to what we believe, which is state communism, and we don't like that. And they're trying to spread it worldwide. So we need to unify to fight against this ideology they're trying to spread. And now, when the Soviet Union dissolved, when that transition was, and I was there then, I was in Eastern Europe. When the Soviet Union was in this transition phase, ceasing to exist, dissolving, Warsaw Pact countries going their own ways, uh, portions of the Soviet Union, like Ukraine, becoming independent, the rationale vanished, right? Because uh, Putin runs a similar economy to our own. Yeah, essentially regulated, slightly regulated capitalism, perhaps less so, but it's certainly in the same genre. So we don't. The whole "we must fight communism," Red Menace stuff goes away. So there's no really, and at that point during the early 90s, let's say, Russia was in a hellacious state. So it was no longer the mega state it had been. Its economy was a mess. Its politics were in chaos. We were in there meddling with it in various ways and so on. In other words, my point being, even before we began in breaking our promises in terms of where NATO was going to spread and rejecting them as members, I think at that moment, the rationale for NATO's existence, however superficial it might have been to begin with, whatever the real motives were for coming up with it, uh, I think it vanished. Am I missing something?
Well, I would only add that it never existed in the first place. If you're asking me if there ever should have been a NATO and then it be abolished in 1991. But absolutely, if that was the justification, as many people believed it was, people across the United States believed there was going to be a peace dividend, there was going to be a scaling back of war, because when the one of the top propaganda arguments for decades has been this is all to stop the Soviet Union around the globe. And it was clear that that was an excuse more than a reason. But people believed it. And they said, okay, well, now there's no Soviet Union. So the Pentagon's going to go away, or at least cut 3/4 of it because the Soviet Union's gone. But of course, the goal of global domination, the goal of weapons sales, the goal of controlling other governments, the goal of profiting from the world's resources, the goal of the irrational urges to, hold power over others. None of that stuff changed an iota. Just one of the big excuses in the propaganda realm, the Soviet Union went away, right? And so, Osama bin Laden can be killed. It doesn't mean that everything that's done in the name of fighting Osama bin Laden is going to go away, because the real justifications, if you look at Andrew Coburn's recent book, The Expansion of NATO in the Clinton Years, I had a wide array of motives behind it, including the Polish-American vote, but principally weapons sales to Eastern Europe. I mean, they're just open about this to this day. You want to be in NATO, you gotta buy weapons, and we have to have what we call interoperability. That means everybody's got to have the same weapons, with US troops coming in to train you on them and maintain them and help you out and maybe make their own base next to yours. And this is the real justification, not the propaganda ones. So you in the treaty, this was supposed to be a nice defensive operation, but defense has been twisted into deterrence, which usually means something that's more provocative than deterrent, or preemption, which means nothing distinguishable from an aggressive war. And so this is what they do. And what saved NATO, what has made NATO the most popular it's ever been right now in this moment, what flipped polling in Sweden and Finland and much of Europe from decades of the public saying to their governments, no, we don't want to be in NATO, to saying, yes, put us in NATO, it's the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Right. So Putin, we must invade Ukraine to stop NATO, had to know perfectly well, as a guy thousands of miles away with no expertise like myself can look, and in 3 seconds it's obvious, know that it's going to be the biggest gift to NATO ever. I mean, there's a Rand Corporation report prior to the Russian invasion. Let's see if we can get Russia to invade Ukraine. This will boost NATO. This will hurt Russia. Let's do this, this, and this to make it happen. And they did those things. Like, I mean, it's a purposeful trap. Putin knowingly walks into it. But war isn't rational. It isn't sane. The other side is, oh, we expanded NATO. That led to a Putin invasion. We must expand NATO more. Right? They're just as mad on both sides.
Well, let's talk about the process leading up to that, okay? And that gets us right at that point in the history, which is, first of all, another highly contested fact. People push back very hard when one says this, but the idea that we promised, whether it was Gorbachev or his successors or both, that if they agreed to the reunification of Germany and perhaps some other concessions as well, we agreed that we would not make frontline countries that border Russia members of NATO. If someone like me says this in a conversation, no matter what reading or research I've done, I often get the response, no, 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 that's not true. That's just a talking point that Putin wants you to say. So what's the real scoop on that?
Well, the best research, I think, is in the National Security Archives, which isn't national or security, but is something created by professors at George Washington University and available to everyone on the internet, where they have collected the testimony of participants from both sides and the minutes and records of meetings from both sides. And it's very clear that it was never put into a treaty. It was never signed and ratified, but it was repeatedly stated by the US Secretary of State, the US President, other US officials, and understood and recorded and acted upon by various Russian officials, including Gorbachev, who had never, changed his story from that day to this. Not 1 inch eastward. NATO will not expand 1 inch eastward, not just not to the Russian border, but not at all east of Germany. And of course, that's been violated endlessly. You now have almost the whole border of the west of Russia with NATO members and NATO bases and NATO missile bases and missiles that may or may not have nuclear weapons, for all Russian radar can tell, aimed at Russia, with the excuse by President Obama that these were aimed at Iran. Put missiles on the border of Russia because of Iran. Nobody even hardly pretended to believe that. It was just a thing Obama said. Former the last U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, more recently, said, actually on a panel on a stage with Vladimir Putin, "Oh, no, 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 Vladimir, this has nothing to do with Russia. It's a jobs program for back in the United States."
We get that. Oh, Biden says the same thing. There was a great study. It was many years ago now, but I think the AFL-CIO did it on the number of jobs you can create per $1 million of defense spending, so-called military spending, versus other government spending. Is very inefficient, among other things, as a way to create American
Oh,
jobs.
yes.
But uh, I'm going to move ahead a little bit, David, because okay, so we have this history where that agreement was violated repeatedly. Now, this gets very, very heated too, but Putin was up front. You don't have to love him. You don't have to. Yeah, he's way too right wing for me, for one thing. I don't like the guy. But he said, as far as I understand it, if Ukraine becomes a NATO member or that's looming, I'm not going to let that happen. Is that right?
Well, let's be very clear. He said that. Saying that does not give him any privilege to mass murder families.
Of
Putin is
course,
engaged
of
in a,
course.
well,
It's a war crime what he's a war criminal. That's
no, you say of course, I say of course, but millions of people say one side must be the devil, one side must be the angel,
right.
and if NATO's to blame, then Putin should kill whoever he wants, and it's all good. So I
Well,
just want to be
yeah,
clear.
and let me put that in context, David, because I think this is so important. That if I have a neighbor who's being bullied by someone, and I say to him, "Hey, why don't you tell him to go f himself? I'll be with you. I'll back you up." And then that someone that he told to go f himself starts to kill his family and burn his house down, and I'm like, "Well, I'll give you a few bucks here or there, but it's not my problem." I feel that that's what we did. That doesn't defend the maniac who's killing the family and burning the house down. But if you encourage somebody to put themselves in a position of provocation and you're not willing to do everything, which if we ever become willing, could include nuclear war, then your hands aren't clean. I mean, that to me is the position, is our moral status with Ukraine. We are not the war criminals, but we have provoked a situation. Again, I'm choosing my words carefully, hence the pause. We've generated the field of potential conflict, and we are not explaining what what the consequences even now might be, as we learn, for example, that Putin and Russia are now doing a nuclear war, tactical nuclear war, battlefield nuclear war exercise on the border with Ukraine, including some of the occupied Ukraine territory. This is the last I heard. So it seems to me we're playing with fire and we're not acting like people who are playing with fire.
I would only quibble with one word, the word we, because I don't want to identify with the US government in that way. I've done everything I could possibly do to oppose this, but I would say it's even worse because my buddy and the guy he's cursed at and who's attacking him sat down together and negotiated peace. And I stepped in, if I'm the US government, the US government and the UK government and NATO stepped in and said, no, you guys cannot negotiate a peaceful settlement. You cannot end this war. This was a month into this now 2 years war. You must continue it. And I'm going to flood the zone with weapons to make sure it continues with those weapons. My expense, on me, my treat. This is what the U.S. government has done in Ukraine. So it's worse. And of course, we almost pretend that Israel didn't exist before October 7th last year. We almost pretend Ukraine didn't exist, before Russia invaded it. But there was an agreement better for all sides than anybody will ever get now in the Minsk II agreement that the West openly advocated not complying with when
April
that
20, April 2022, is that the one you're referring to when Boris Johnson from the UK went and said you can't do this deal? Um, I know that
this
was
was a
one.
new deal negotiated in Turkey, which of course is one of the reasons Turkey is a questionable member of NATO. And yes, Boris Johnson and the U.S. and the West said, no, you cannot negotiate peace. You must continue the war, and we'll give you the weapons, and we'll fight to the last Ukrainian.
Right. And to me, and people also forget, by the way, that before all this took place, that Zelensky ran for president as a peace candidate, saying he would negotiate and deal with Russia, which gets me to my, next question about all of this, which, and NATO figures into this. People, Democrats in particular, celebrate John F. Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is a fascinating and I think important historical example of certain things. Uh, but if you look at the details, okay, so the Soviets put missiles very close to the United States, kind of equivalent to what NATO is doing with Russia. We blockaded. Things got to the brink of nuclear war, and Kennedy said, disregarded his generals, if the reports I've read are accurate, said, I'm going to de-escalate this through negotiation. He and Khrushchev agreed Kennedy would take U.S. missiles out of Turkey, which was close to Russia, and the Soviets would take their nuclear missiles out of Cuba. World saved, everybody happy. But it seems that if anyone mentions any kind of negotiated de-escalation to the conflict in Ukraine, everyone, including Democrats, equates diplomacy with treachery or with surrender to war crimes. And I'm wondering where, does NATO have a role in all that? Because it seems to me our culture has shifted to an even more bellicose nature than it was in the early 1960s at the height of the Cold War.
NATO has a major propaganda arm, not to mention its weapons dealing arm, which is the biggest chunk of it. But NATO wants to take over communications, not to mention science, not to mention education, not to mention crimes and terrorism and piracy. NATO wants, to not need a war for existence. But I think the most important lesson to learn out of the Cuban Missile Crisis is that everybody was intentionally taught the wrong lesson by the guy who did the right thing, John F. Kennedy, right? He publicly said, I beat the Soviet Union by thumping my chest and threatening hellfire. Privately, he negotiated the deal that you just described. And I think it's important, and I'd rather have it that way than the reverse. Don't get me wrong. But we have to get to the point someday where people have the courage and the decency to not only do the right thing secretly, but to openly own it, to say, I negotiated peace because it's better than nuclear apocalypse. I negotiated peace, and the Israel lobby can go to hell. Be willing to do it publicly and wholeheartedly, and with the proper educational lesson attached to it, because Kennedy privately said, until the conscientious objector has the prestige and respect of the soldier, we'll keep having these wars. He never said that publicly in front of a microphone, right? This is what we have to get to someday.
Absolutely. And before we go, David, I just want to briefly bring up, since you mentioned the Israel lobby, Gaza. Okay, we all know that the Israel lobby is a powerful political force in the United States. So, uh, as the genocide began in Gaza, it was not a surprise how few American politicians initially spoke up against it. I would say the ferocity of Joe Biden's support of it has surprised some people. But I think what I was a little bit surprised by was the intensity and bellicosity of the rhetoric from Germany, from France, I mean, Germany's the worst, but UK, that all the NATO countries I could think of, major ones anyway, were, it seemed to me, coming from a place of bloodlust. And this shocked me. I mean, I understand that in a certain tactical sense, Israel is NATO's and America's battleship in the Middle East. I get that. But still, and I get that Germany is trying to expunge its genocidal history by backing another genocide, which is paradoxical, but I still see it. Uh, but I just don't get the fury or the rhetoric of fury from whether it's Ursula von der Leyen or whomever else. Macron seems to, in France, seems to be dialing it back a little bit, but still, what is it with NATO and a country that is not near the North Atlantic or North America?
Well, most NATO partners are not near those things. Israel is a NATO partner. It is a country that buys NATO weapons and that sells NATO weapons and that teaches NATO the technologies of new weapons, battle tested on men, women, and children. It's I mean, all of that is true. Nonetheless, many NATO members, including the aforementioned troublesome member of Turkey, but not just Turkey, many NATO members are very reluctant. You're not going to get a NATO consensus in support of this genocide, and that's important. But I think mostly there's a division between government officials
Hmm.
that are pro-war ideologically, are puppets of the US government politically, and are to various degrees servants of the weapons profiting industry, and the public. The public in Europe is not gung-ho for this war and genocide, neither is the public in the United States. But Joe Biden, remember the last war that Joe Biden had any quarrel with whatsoever was the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, and he caught hell for it. He was
Yeah.
a wimp. He was a coward. He was a pinko. Didn't love our troops, right? And people think, oh, well, what does that matter? But it matters, because who knows what power that guy's going to have decades later and what lessons he's going to have learned, that he must be pro-war at all times. He was the most gung-ho Democrat on Capitol Hill for the war on Iraq and every other war since the first Gulf War. That's a lot of wars. He's never seen a war he had any problem with at all. And he thinks that that's been the political key, right? It's made him president, right? Even though senators who backed the war on Iraq couldn't be president for a long time, and that's why you had Obama come in, who wasn't there in time to have made that mistake, right? And you couldn't have Hillary, and you couldn't have Kerry, but eventually people forget, and so Biden thinks be pro-war and win, and please the Israel lobby. And, we haven't shown him that that isn't true, and we need to.
So, well, one way to do that and changing the culture and the environment, the political culture of this country, and its seemingly endless, bottomless enthusiasm for war is by speaking often and visibly and clearly about the fact that not only is war morally bad and bad for people that are victimized by it, but also not in anybody's interests except a few powerful and privileged people in our country and maybe a few other places around the world. But for the rest of us, it's not a good idea. I don't think I'll give you the last word, but I don't think the politicians will change, most of them, until a public understanding of the horrible destruction and wastefulness of it all is even more pervasive than it is now. So that's why I value the work of people like you. But you have the last word if you want it.
Well, I couldn't agree more. It could have been our founding statement in creating World Beyond War is much of what the work we do at rootsaction.org is based on, and why I love some of these student campus movements that are against all weapons and all wars and want every dime of their tuition kept out of all militarism, not just one particular weapon system or war. They've got it. That's right. We got to support that.
Yeah, they get it, right? And so do you. So David Swanson, executive director of World Without War, author and organizer. As always, thanks for your great work and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks, Richard.
We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero. We depend on your support here at the 0 Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.